Hi everybody, welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. This is a video I took last year when we went to Carthage. It was my first time ever going to Carthage jail. We went there after the visitor center was closed, so I just walked around, made this video for my other channel called Explore Church Sites. And over the last couple of days, I've come across a really interesting idea about Joseph and Hyrum Smith potentially being the two witnesses. And if they're not the two witnesses, possibly a foreshadowing of the two witnesses or part of the pattern, because sometimes there's multiple fulfillments. But it wasn't until last year when I went to Nauvoo for the first time and took the tour that I found out that after the martyrdom of these two, their bodies went through a really interesting journey. They didn't just get buried in the spot that they're at right now, but they were initially buried in secret and then moved from one location to another. And to this day, at least with Joseph Smith, he's not buried where he's supposed to be buried according to his wishes. And I was thinking about the two witnesses, how there's a part talking about the fact that once they were killed, they would not be buried. That's the way that it reads in the Bible. It just, the surface level reading is just like, oh, well, yeah, they won't allow their bodies to be buried for 3.5 days. And so it sounds pretty straightforward, but I'm going to show you how a lot of what we read about the two witnesses actually seem to fit Joseph and Hyrum Smith very well, beyond just the burial issue. Okay, so the first thing I want to read is this from Elder Bruce R. McConkie from his book called The Millennial Messiah. Because sometimes we read the scriptures and we think it's really plain, it's really simple. We come up with this picture in our heads of what's supposed to happen according to our own private interpretation. But Elder Bruce R. McConkie said, in regards to prophecies, especially ones having to do with the second coming, Jesus' next statements seem to be commentary and explanation relative to events that will happen both before and after his coming. It is not always possible for us in our present state of spiritual enlightenment to put every event into an exact category or time frame. We are left to ponder and wonder about many things, perhaps to keep us alert and attentive to the commandments should the Lord come in our day. And some of the prophetic utterances apply to both pre- and post-millennial events. Some have, in this part right here is probably more applicable to this video. Some have an initial and partial fulfillment in our day, and shall have a second and grander completion in the days ahead. Now, you might be thinking, well, it specifically says that they're going to preach for 1,260 days. That's what it says in Revelation chapter 11, verse 3. I recently did a video talking about these 3.5 numbers. The scriptures have various ways of talking about periods that come in 3.5, units of measurement of time. So sometimes it's 3.5 days, as is the case for the time that the bodies of the two witnesses would not be buried and would be lying in the streets. We got 42 months. We have 1,260 days. We also have 1,260 years. This came as a result of a Joseph Smith translation. In the next chapter, it talks about the woman, which is the church, fleeing into the wilderness for 1,260 days in the King James Version. But the Joseph Smith translation corrects that and says it's 1,260 years. I'm not going to read it right now. Well, no, yeah, I am. In the Institute Student Manual, when it's talking about this concept of 3.5 this and a 3.5 that, it suggests that it's probably a limited period of time during which evil forces are allowed to do their work. It may represent imperfection and apostasy. It may also suggest that God will not allow evil to go on unchecked. Evil's time is bounded, and its time limits are set. So maybe it's literal. Maybe only sometimes is it literal. Maybe it's completely symbolic when we're talking about 3.5 days, 3.5 years, whatever. So in the case of the woman going into the wilderness, the great apostasy was not in terms of, thousands of days. It was more like thousands of years, almost 2,000 years. And this was a really good correction by Joseph Smith that the apostasy, the great apostasy, would go on for a long time, right? So if we go back to Revelation, I want to read these verses about the two witnesses. And it's using that same number for them, but in this case, there is no Joseph Smith translation to fix this from days to years. And so if we use the same logic, it may be that their ministry is not in terms of thousands of years, but more on the order of thousands of days. Or maybe it represents simply this last dispensation. Or maybe it just represents the time in which Joseph Smith was alive and was president of the church. So let's just think outside the box for a minute. I'm not saying that this is doctrine, but let's pretend that it says, and I will give power unto Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith and others, and they shall prophesy, for the time that they're doing their ministry, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 candlesticks standing before God, the God of the earth. And if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth, and devoureth their enemies. That makes me think of one example, and I'm sure that there's other times, but here in Missouri, in Richmond, which is about 45 minutes northeast, mostly east of Independence, you have this site. This is one of the sites in Missouri that Joseph Smith was in jail. We have his initial hearing was in Independence, and that site is marked, but there's not anything aside from a sidewalk marker to mark where he was first incarcerated. And then he was moved here to Richmond, and there's this famous story of Joseph Smith rebuking the guards. Or you could say, metaphorically, symbolically, breathing fire on them. I'm just going to read this last part. So these guards were being very vile and just using horrible language, and Joseph Smith couldn't take any more of it. And it says down here, as Parley P. Pratt later recorded the event, Joseph majestically rose to his feet and spoke in a thunderous voice these memorable words: "Silence, ye fiends of the infernal pit. In the name of Jesus Christ, I rebuke you and command you to be still. I will not live another minute and hear such language. Cease such talk, or you or I die this instant." The astonished guards, both speechless and trembling, were silent the remainder of the night. And now, in 2026, or I guess from 2011 when this was first put up until 2026, now there's a marker that tells that story at the site where it happened. It's this empty lot right here behind the white picket fence. And if I did more research, I'm sure I could find many other times that Joseph Smith rebuked people, right? Breathed fire on them, the spiritual fire of God. Okay, so if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. The interesting thing about that is, and I would have to do much more research. This is just like the first time I'm thinking about this, but I came across this book called The Fate of the Persecutors of the Prophet Joseph Smith by N.B. Lundwall. This is in chapter 16 called Physical and Mental Sufferings of persecutors. And I just want to give you one little example. This is told by George E. King. I'm not going to read this whole thing. I just want to show you what happened to his grandfather, who was one of the persecutors, according to this account. He said, "My grandfather was one of the leaders of the mob which murdered Joe Smith. I questioned him further as to what became of his, I questioned him further as to what became of his grandfather afterwards. He related that following the assassination of Joseph Smith, his grandfather never saw a well day, although he lived for several years afterwards. His condition grew progressively worse, and physicians of the day who called to attend him were unable to diagnose it as any known affliction. But his suffering was so intense that he frequently expressed the desire to obtain poison to end it all. His family very carefully kept anything of that nature out of his reach, and at his final demise, he actually had rotted alive, finally dying in intense agony." Now, there are other accounts in here, and this is similar to some of the things that I collect, especially on my spreadsheet called Quotes, Visions, and Visitations, where you're kind of just relying on what they say. It could be exaggerated, it could be misremembered, it could flat out just be a fabrication. And this is pointed out if you go to Doctrine and Covenant Central, their website. They also have this podcast called Church History Matters. They point this out. Now, these are scholars, and at this part, they say, talking about this book that we just read from, they say, "Unfortunately, the historical credibility of most of these stories is seriously lacking since they are based on unverifiable hearsay rather than well-documented and corroborated records. These morbid tales are thus the stuff of legend and folklore rather than a robust documentary record." Now, that of course doesn't mean that they're not true, and I don't think that that's what these guys are saying, but when you're doing more professional work like they do in study, you have to be rigorous. You can't just be like, "Oh yeah, look what this person over here said. He heard somebody else say." You can't do that. But for our purposes, you and me, it could be true. Well, and we'll find out at some point. I wouldn't be surprised. I would not be surprised if those, going back to Revelation 11, "If any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed." I wouldn't be surprised if it happened. The trick is actually verifying it. But we'll know after this life. We'll know for sure. Okay, so moving on. "These have power to shut heaven, that is, rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues as often as they will." As far as I know, I don't think that Joseph Smith did this, but he doesn't have to tell us everything that he did. And I've also wondered if the two witnesses could apply to the whole series of prophets that we've had in this dispensation. Rather than two specific individuals, it may be more the concept of "my word will be established in the mouth of two or three witnesses." I don't know. But we also don't know every single thing that Joseph Smith did or any of his successors. So this one, I'm not going to spend too much on verse 6. If it is very literal and Joseph Smith did not do any of these things or initiate plagues or things like that, then yeah, maybe they're not the two witnesses. But okay, verse 7. "And when they have finished their testimony." Okay, now think about this. Put this image in your mind. When they have finished their testimony. "And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them, and kill them. And their bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified." Now, right here, you might be saying, look, this is specifically talking about Jerusalem. Specifically. It could be. But it could be talking about any stake of Zion, which is a city of holiness. I have that quote from Bruce R. McConkie. I should have pulled it up, where he said, "Anywhere that you create a stake in Zion, you're creating a city of holiness. You're creating a new Jerusalem and such." So is this literally Jerusalem? It could be, because the two witnesses are raised up to the Jews. Although we do have different definitions of who the Jews are. I don't have these quotes right now, but I'm sure you are aware of it. Sometimes the Lamanites, the modern day Native Americans and descendants of Lehi, are referred to as Jews. So you see how things can get kind of murky sometimes. It may be very, very, very literal, or some of the lines might be blurred, and we might be talking about different definitions of Jerusalem and Jews. Here, it's talking about Jerusalem spiritually being called Sodom and Egypt, because what was supposed to be a holy city prepared to receive Christ when he came, and some did. But if it had been completely ready, everybody would have accepted him. If everybody had been righteous and would have been a true Jerusalem, a true Zion people. But it wasn't. You had members of the church that thought that they knew better. They thought they knew what Christ was supposed to be. And when he came, they rejected him. And they went beyond just rejecting him. They actually participated in his demise, in his crucifixion, along with the Romans. So you think about Nauvoo. And what's interesting is I'm going to read something in just a minute here that refers to Nauvoo as a holy city. So you could read this like, Christ went to a holy city, which in reality had the spirit of Sodom and Egypt in it. And the same thing is going to happen to these two witnesses, potentially Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith. What was supposed to be a holy city, Nauvoo, and it mostly was, had dissenters who turned on Joseph Smith and helped to kill him. So, for example, I have this pulled up. Oh, I think it's toward the end here. Just as an example, this is on the church website about the Nauvoo expositor. On Friday, June 7th, 1844, which that's 20 days before the martyrdom. That's kind of interesting. It's on a 7. On Friday, June 7th, 1844, dissenters from the church published the one and only issue of an opposition newspaper they called the Nauvoo Expositor. The publishers were a former first counselor in the first presidency, William Law, Law's brother, Wilson, Charles Ivins, Charles and Robert Foster, and Francis and Chauncey Higby. The dissenters, several of whom had been recently excommunicated, published the Expositor to stir up controversy over practices and teachings with which they strongly disagreed. So you have this, again, the way that Christ describes it on the Mount of Olives when he comes for the second coming. He was wounded in the house of his friends. And you had this situation. I'm not a Nauvoo historian, but this is just like a small example of there were members of the church who left the church, apostatized, and became persecutors of Joseph Smith. So it's kind of a similar situation comparing Nauvoo and Jerusalem. Okay, and now this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time in this video. And they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. Again, this could literally be 3.5 days, or it may just describe a short period of time, not in terms of thousands of years, not in terms of years, but in terms of days, or maybe part of the last dispensation. Not the entire last dispensation, but just part of it or something. A shorter period of time. Okay, so I came across this really interesting paper. It's called The Tomb of Joseph. You can find this on BYU. Let's see it. Let's go to the top really quick. This is by Susan Easton Black. And I'm obviously not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to give you an idea of why this could be true of Joseph and Hyrum Smith, like their bodies not being properly um, buried according to Joseph Smith's wishes. Here, let me zoomed in a little bit too much. All right, here we go. About 8 a.m. on Friday, the 28th of June, the remains of Joseph and Hyrum were placed in rough boxes, put into 2 wagons, and then covered with prairie hay, blankets, and bushes to protect them from the hot sun. A guard of 8 soldiers, led by Samuel H. Smith and accompanied by Willard Richards, was detached to escort the remains to Nauvoo. Between 2:30 and 3 p.m., the procession had reached Nauvoo and was moving along Mulholland Street, where the assembled Nauvoo Legion, the city council, and thousands of mourners vented their sorrow. The procession moved slowly into the city, passing by the unfinished Nauvoo Temple, where additional crowds had gathered. Sarah Levitt observed, quote, "Such mourning and lamentations was seldom ever heard on earth." End quote. George Morris penned, "Such a time of mourning I never witnessed, neither before nor since." Dan Jones descriptively wrote, "Oh, the sorrowful scene to be seen in Nauvoo that day. There has never been, nor will there be, anything like it. Everyone sat along the streets, all the shops closed, and every business forgotten." The procession proceeded down Main Street to the Mansion House, where the bodies were taken into the dining room and the door closed. The wagon was driven inside the back gate, and the gate was locked. No one was allowed in the yard except the guards and the prophet's special friends. The 8 to 10,000 saints assembled near the Mansion House heard brief remarks from church leaders. Those assembled were admonished to go home quietly and promised that beginning at 8 in the morning of the 29th of June, 1844, the remains of the martyrs would be viewed by all. After this had been accomplished, the bodies were viewed first by the remaining family members. Their tears were, quote unquote, enough to rend the heart of adamant, wrote Villate Campbell. At 7 a.m. on Saturday, the 29th of June, the bodies were placed in white cambric-lined coffins covered with black velvet and fastened with brass nails. Over the face of each corpse was a lid hung with brass hinges that held a square of glass. At 8 a.m., the public viewing began. It was estimated that over 10,000 persons visited the remains, quote unquote, from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., entering at the west door and exiting at the north door of the Mansion House. Okay. At 5 p.m., the Mansion House was cleared of the mourners, and the family was invited to make their final farewells. The coffins were then concealed. Now, this is where things get interesting. The coffins were then concealed in a bedroom closet in the northeast corner of the mansion. Carefully placed into the awaiting hearse were rough pine boxes filled with bags of sand in place of the martyrs' remains. Okay, so this was the beginning of a secret burial. They did like a decoy burial. Sandbags or coffins that were filled with sandbags. When the mock funeral procession began, the cortege moved down Main Street, passed by the temple, and stopped at the burial vault. A mock burial was conducted inside the vault, located just south of the temple. William W. Phelps preached the public funeral sermon near the temple. About midnight on the 29th of June, long after the mourners had retired, the coffins containing the bodies were taken from the Mansion House by Dimmick B. Huntington, Edward Hunter, William D. Huntington, William Marks, Jonathan H. Holmes, oh my gosh, Gilbert Goldsmith, Alpheus Cutler, which, by the way, he's one of the ones that started a splinter group that became headquartered here in Independence. It's a church that has gone extinct, but their church headquarters, it's a little white chapel, is just south of the temple lot. Lorenzo D. Wasson, and Philip B. Lewis. These men were guarded by James Emmett. They carried the coffins through the mansion house garden, around the pump, into the Nauvoo house. Let's take a look at the Nauvoo house really quick. Right here. So this is the Nauvoo house. This was a building that was commanded by the Lord to be built. It was supposed to be essentially like an inn or a hotel. And in my mind, I think it would have functioned as kind of like a proto visitor center for people that were coming to Nauvoo. It was going to be a hotel, but it would also, I think the intention was for it to act like a visitor center where visitors could learn about the church. So this is just a little bit down the street from the mansion house, which I don't know if I have it in this video. No, I don't. But this is just on the other side of this dirt road right here is the Smith family homestead. And then just a little bit up the road, just a tiny bit, and across this other street, you have the mansion house. So this is where they were initially buried, is over here, if you didn't know. Okay, back to this. The bodies were interred in the basement story of the uncompleted structure. After the burial, the ground was flattened and covered with chips of wood, stone, and other rubbish to camouflage the site. That evening, a violent rainstorm removed any trace of the burial. Okay, the next section is called Exhumation of the Bodies. The bodies remained in the basement of the north wing of the Nauvoo house until fall 1844, when they were removed by Dimmock B. Huntington and then just all these people, at the request of Joseph's wife, Emma Smith. Okay, so they were secretly buried there. She requested that they be moved. And then it continues. They were next interred near the Mississippi River, where they were, quote unquote, buried side by side. The location of this burial was 38 feet south and 20 feet west of the southwest corner of the homestead, under the floor of a small shed called a bee house or spring house. According to Samuel O. Benyon, they were buried deep in unmarked graves. After the death of Emma Smith in 1879 and the demolition of the bee house that once sheltered the graves, conjecture arose over the exact location of the martyrs' burial site. So, great. Family members could not point with confidence to where the bodies were laid. Okay, so let's pause here. Do you see this problem where, well, you don't even see the problem yet. We're going to get to the part where Joseph Smith had a specific place that he wanted to be buried. There was a burial vault, and I think it's that burial vault where they did the mock burial. I think that's where he was actually supposed to be buried. And it was like a commandment. Brigham Young described it as a commandment, like something that he was religiously obligated to do. But they didn't do it. You'll see why in a minute. So instead of going just right away to where he was supposed to be buried, there's this whole rigmarole that they go through where the bodies are first hidden while there's the mock burial, and then they're moved over to the Nauvoo house, and then after that they're moved over to underneath the bee house or the spring house, and then that got demolished, and then everybody lost where the bodies were. They couldn't say for sure. Okay, so what now? When the waters of Lake Cooper threatened to flood the area where the graves were thought to be, leaders of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because unfortunately they're the ones that own those properties because of Emma Smith and because of Joseph Smith III. It was the Smith family properties. So the RLDS owned that. They decided to locate the bodies and remove them to higher ground and to place an appropriate monument over their graves. W.O. Hands was appointed to direct a small group of surveyors and engineers to search for the missing graves. They began digging on the 9th of January, 1928, and on the 16th of January, they found them. Here, I want to point something out that, thank goodness, I saw on Doctrine and Covenants Central. So they have their podcast episode here, and they have like a bullet point list of like the key takeaways. And the last one says, some historians argue that Joseph and Hyrum's skulls may have been misidentified during their 1928 reburial, raising uncertainty about whether their current graves in Nauvoo are correctly marked. So, when you go to Nauvoo, when you go to Nauvoo and you go over to, oh wait, here's the mansion house. Sorry. Let's just skip forward to this part. Here's the mansion house. So this is catty corner from the homestead. Okay, so now we're facing the other way. This is the Smith family homestead. There's a wall. I'm turning around. Over there is the mansion house to the right. If you walk around the Smith family homestead to the other side, you come to the Smith family cemetery. Okay, and it has this historical marker that details who's buried there. And let me find the spot. This is where Joseph Smith, right here in the middle, and Hyrum Smith, I think he's the one to the left, and then Emma to the right. This is where they're supposed to be buried, supposedly, if they identified the skulls correctly in the case of Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith. It may be Emma and two other people, for all anybody knows, I guess. I don't know what the debate is. I can't give you the details. And in the background there, you see the house on the homestead. So we have that problem. Again, we're talking about this because if they are the two witnesses, or if they're part of the pattern, if they're a partial fulfillment or something like that, there's this part where it says, and they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, which may be just a unspecified period of time when we're still in this fallen world before the second coming, whatever, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves, or in this case, in the correct spot. Their bodies may not even be where they're supposed to be right now, but they're definitely not where Joseph Smith wanted their bodies to be. Okay, so going back to this, the remains of Joseph Smith and his brother Hyrum, as well as those of Emma, were exhumed from their resting place. The remains were arranged in silk-lined wood boxes that were placed side by side, 17 feet north of where the bodies of Joseph and Hyrum had been exhumed. Then the bodies were reburied on Friday, the 20th of January, 1928, and the graves were marked. So that's where they're supposedly at right now, what I just showed you. I'm not going to read this next part. I was going to, but this video is going longer than I thought it would. But this essentially tells the story of how, when they did this, the RLDS didn't inform our church. Our church wanted to know. They wanted to have a representative there to at least participate in it. The mission president of the Central States Mission, Samuel O. Benyon, he did hear of it, and he was able to rush from Independence to Nauvoo to be part of that. And he's like, well, why did you not tell us? And they're like, well, we thought that Brigham Young took the bodies with him to Salt Lake, and we wanted to prove that it wasn't true. So anyway, And then finally, together, the two churches, they put these proper, like this monument together so that they had a proper monument over their gravesite. Okay, now Joseph's tomb. Look at this. The tomb of Joseph is not an untold story, but it is one that has been obscured by time. A few years before his tragic death, the prophet built a limestone burial vault on the south side of the temple block and called it the Tomb of Joseph. The first reference to the tomb in the personal writings of Joseph Smith appears on the 23rd of August, 1842, in reference to Joseph Smith Sr. The prophet said of his deceased father, "Sacred to me is his dust in the spot where he is laid. Sacred to me is the tomb I have made to encircle o'er his head. Let the memory of my father eternally live." Okay, I'm going to skip the next part. It's just kind of a repetition of that. John Taylor spoke of the tomb of Joseph in the Salt Lake Tabernacle, 1870. "I knew a man many of you knew who built a tomb for himself in the city of Nauvoo. His name was Joseph Smith, and many of you heard him say what I will now relate. Said he, I expect when the time of the resurrection comes to rise up in my tomb there and strike hands with my brethren, with my father and with my mother, and hail the day when we shall burst from the barriers of the tomb and awake to immortal life. Have you ever heard him talk thus? I have." Okay, end of quote. Brigham Young added his confirmation that Joseph Smith wanted to be buried in the tomb he had built south of the temple. Quote, "While Joseph was alive, he said, 'If I am slain in battle or fall by the hands of my enemies,'" now, think about that. "If I am slain in battle or fall by the hands of my enemies, I want my body brought to Nauvoo and laid in the tomb I have prepared." It was Brigham's desire to carry out the prophet's wish. He planned to place the remains of the martyrs in the tomb of Joseph before the Mormon exodus from Nauvoo. At General Conference in October 1845, Brigham Young remarked, quote, "Joseph once said, with outstretched arms, 'If I fall in battle in Missouri, I want you to bring my bones back and deposit them in that sepulcher. I command you to do it.'" Now, I'm not an expert in the language of that time, so that may have just been a very strong way of saying, seriously, I want you to bury me here. Or he could actually be giving like a prophetic command, which would make it all that much more significant if he is one of the two witnesses. Don't you think? "I command you to do it in the name of the Lord." Well, I mean, he uses the name. Yeah, he says in the name of the Lord. "I command you to do it in the name of the Lord." End quote. Knowing that the prophet's wishes to be buried in the tomb of Joseph had not been fulfilled, Young declared, "We are determined also to use every means in our power to do all that Joseph told us, and we will petition Sister Emma in the name of Israel's God to let us deposit the remains of Joseph according as he commanded us. And if she will not consent to it, our garments are clear. Then when he wakes in the morning of the resurrection, he can talk with her, not with me. The sin shall be upon her head, not ours." The remains of the prophet and patriarch were never laid in the tomb. Now, there's a website you can visit. This is Tomb of Joseph Museum, because the rest of this paper, it goes on to talk about like locating it, and there's different theories as to where it may be. I want to read this. Robinson concludes with hope, quote, "that someday in the future the exact location of the tomb might be located. Until that time, we can but wonder." On March 24th, 1995, I attended the weekly Religious Education Friday Faculty Forum. Oh my gosh, that's a mouthful. I attended the weekly religious education Friday faculty forum at Brigham Young University and listened to Robert J. Matthews present a lecture on the funeral and burial of Joseph Smith and his brother Hyrum. In his presentation, he said, "You can walk over very holy ground and not even know it is holy." So that's interesting. Um, and then the case of the tomb of Joseph has been presented. Known facts are clearly identified, and a cave in Nauvoo awaits inspection. Another possible site was destroyed in 1973. If the hypothesis proves true, does that suggest that the prophet Joseph Smith and his family members, now numbering 17, who are buried in the garden-like cemetery near the homestead, should be interred again? That would be presumptuous, but what it does suggest is the need for further discussion about the tomb of Joseph. Now, you let me know what you think. If we were able to verify everything, we have the correct bodies, and we 100% know the correct site of the tomb where it's supposed to be, should those bodies be moved? I'm of the opinion yes, but maybe it's just because I think that way. But anyway, there's the Tomb of Joseph Museum. So you might consider going to see that when you go to Nauvoo. There's also this like documentary that they put together. This is on Nauvoo Temple Gallery YouTube channel. I haven't watched this yet, but I'm sure it's fascinating. Yeah. Now, let's finish this off. Let's just do verses 10 and 11. That's basically all we need to really do. Well, maybe 12 too. "And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwelt on the earth." Okay, now there was plenty of rejoicing. There's this LDS Living article, what newspapers in the 1800s said about the martyrdom of Joseph and Hyrum. Oh yeah, by the way, in front of the Nauvoo Temple, you have like this statue that has both of them on horseback. Just the visual of it, you look at this, you look at Carthage jail, you have this saying, I can't remember, I think it's in the scriptures where it talks about them in life they were united, in death they cannot be divided, something like that. It's wording that would be fitting, I think, of the two witnesses, in statues like this as well. But anyway, rejoicing. So I just have a couple things to read here. On the other extreme, some papers, such as the Jonesboro Whig, thoroughly supported the actions of the mob, praising the murders as a victory. Quote, "Some of the public journals of the country, we are sorry to see, regret the death of that blasphemous wretch, Joe Smith. The Mormon prophet our deliberate judgment is that he ought to have been dead 10 years ago, and that those who at length have deprived him of his life have done the cause of God and of the country good service." End quote. Reverend Brownlow did not hide his enthusiasm when he concluded, "Smith was killed as he should have been. 3 cheers for the brave company who shot him to pieces." Yikes. Now look at this next part. Look at this next part as we think about verse 8, where it says, "And their body shall lie in the street of the great city." And, we want to interpret that as meaning literally Jerusalem in Israel. Well, let's see. The New York Herald even went so far as to say that, quote, "The death of the modern Muhammad will seal the fate of Mormonism. They cannot get another Joe Smith. The holy city," referring to Nauvoo, "the holy city must tumble into ruins, and the Latter-day Saints have indeed come to the latter day." End quote. Others also spoke out against Joseph, calling his death the end of the, quote, great deceiver who has no doubt seduced and ensnared numbers to their ruin, and claiming he would be remembered for his, quote unquote, deeds of darkness. Now, I wasn't able to find any accounts of people giving each other gifts. I did find this. This is not, as far as I know, a gift, but you see this thing right here? This is a horn that holds gunpowder. This is on the church website. It says, when we speak of the mob that killed Joseph and Hyrum Smith in Carthage jail, we sometimes forget that each of these men had names and lives. One of these men, from the militia in the neighboring town of Warsaw, Illinois, commemorated his participation in the killings on this horn, which carried his gunpowder. And then this is what it says. You can see it you can kind of make it out here, the inscription. But it says, Warsaw regulators, the end of the polygamist Joseph Smith, killed, misspelled by the way, at Carthage jail, June 27th, 1844. If there was somebody that did this for himself, I wouldn't be surprised if there were people that did some kind of gift giving, whether it's something like this to commemorate what they did, maybe getting together at somebody's house and having dinner, a party, a ball. Excuse me. I wouldn't be surprised, but I can't verify that. Okay. And after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. So this is referring to them coming back to life, being resurrected. Again, maybe 3.5 days doesn't literally mean 3.5 days. Maybe it simply means this dispensation. At the end of this dispensation, when Christ comes and you have the morning of the first resurrection, they're going to be resurrected, and the enemies of the church are going to see them, and they're going to be terrified. Great fear fell upon them which saw them. Could you imagine that? You think about the people that speak out against the church on social media and other places, that trash the prophet Joseph Smith. If they were resurrected, Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith, and all of us being familiar with these kind of images, especially, I mean, it's not just members of the church, but people that are opposed to the church that put out that kind of content. They're familiar with these images. Could you imagine if we saw these two in real life? And right after that, you have essentially the destruction of the wicked. It would be pretty amazing, I think. So, I think I covered everything that I wanted to. But I think you could potentially make the case. You could make the case. In the scriptures, there's a lot of times where, when we're talking about New Jerusalem and Old Jerusalem, sometimes they're interchangeable. There's other times that, I can't think of any examples right now, but there's times in the scriptures where, especially when it deals with prophecy, terms, locations, sometimes people are interchangeable. There's multiple fulfillments. And maybe this is one of those things. Maybe this is a type of fulfillment. Maybe it's combined with other things that are going to happen or have happened already. But this is one of those ways that prophecy could have been fulfilled, and we just didn't recognize it because there's no one there to tell it to us except for the Lord himself. And if this is it, he hasn't told us yet, but it's just something to think about. Instead of saying, no, the second coming cannot happen right now, we have not seen the two witnesses. Well, my question would be, how can you be so sure that your interpretation is so correct? You could be right, but you could also be wrong. All right, well, that's going to be it for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.